Computer Science and Engineering Colloquia features accessible talks by leading computer scientists and computer engineers from across the region and around the world.
Thanks for coming. I'm really happy to welcome Kirstin Petersen to give our colloquium today. And Kirstin got her initial degrees in Denmark from Odense University College of Engineering and from the University of Southern Denmark, and did her PhD at Harvard University in computer science with Radhika Nagpal. And for the last year and a half, I guess, she's been a postdoc at the Max Planck Institute in Germany. She's been working with Metin City, who some of you know. He's given a talk here in the past. And so welcome, and I'm very excited to hear your talk.
Thank you, Blake. Today I'm going to be talking about robot collectives, or swarm robotics, if you like. And it's really a field that ties together many different disciplines, from modeling and algorithms to real physical robotic hardware and even the biological counterparts. And as you will find throughout my talk, I have a soft spot for these robot collectives applied to automated construction. That's why I'm going to focus most of my talk on these robot collectives applied to, that I did during my thesis, which can do collective construction of user-specified three-dimensional structures. I'm going to talk about the termites that inspired that system. Then I'm going to get into my current work at the Max Planck Institute with soft robot collectives and novel actuator methodologies to enable those robots. And finally, I'll sort of allude to my future research vision of actually applying these robots into real-world unstructured environments. But first, let's address why we should be interested in robot collectives at all. So the idea behind a collective of robots is that you can replace a single really complicated and expensive robots with a bunch of simpler, inexpensive robots. You can achieve a high degree of parallelism because a lot of robots can work on the same task at once, and redundancy because if most of those robots are the same, it doesn't matter if half fail. The rest will still be able to complete whatever task you've given them. Now, we know this is a reasonable approach because we see examples in nature all the time, from couples of Monera birds to families of beavers, hundreds of paper wasps, and even thousands of weaver ants. And of course, my favorite example, which are these species of African termites, millions of which come together with no central point of coordination to build these amazing mounds out of soil. And it's not just amazing that they're able to do this, they're also able to do so in a remarkably error-tolerant manner. So here you see a perfectly healthy mound with a tree growing inside it, right? So it's my dream to eventually create robot collectives that might work just as well under internal and external perturbations. And to do that, we really need to focus on very simple, very robust, and very scalable hardware. So I'm a strong contender for embodied intelligence, which is a means by which we optimize the hardware specifically for the task at hand in order to limit the need for complicated sensors and control. If you think of a termite, very vulnerable on its own, has a soft, squishy body. It's a delicious treat for many other insects. It's completely blind. But as long as you place that termite as a part of the collective and into that environment it's constructing for itself, it's remarkably robust. So it's that sort of approach I like to take to robot collectives, and it's the reason why I really like this concept of automated construction, where we get to design not only the robots, but also the environment, the structure, and the building material that the robot operates in. So we get to optimize the two for each other and thereby create even simpler hardware. Other than being a really good sort of task with which to study robot collectives, automated construction also has the ability to improve speed and efficiency in construction, and even more so, to remove humans from hazardous environments. In 2014, more than 19 of all work-related injuries reported in the US were due to construction workers. On average, 2 people a day are fatally injured on US construction sites. That's a pretty sizable number. I'm interested in enabling construction in settings that have been considered too dangerous for humans to work, like disaster areas, where you can imagine robots coming in to build supporting structures in the rubble, or extraterrestrial areas where you can imagine robots building temporary scaffolds within which humans can work safely later on. Now, lots of people are working on robot collectives. I found a couple of cool examples here at UW. This year's from Eric Clavin's lab with these robotic chemistry-inspired testbeds. So this is really cool work for 2D assembly, but these robots sort of lack the ability to interact with and modify the environment in the way that I'm looking for in my research. These here are more along the lines of what I do. These are the swarm bots from EPFL. Every robot here has the ability to sense, think, and move on its own, and they have this little gripper with which to grab onto other robots if they want to enforce or encounter a bigger obstacle. Typically, hardware like this, though, has issues, right? It's rather complicated, it's prone to error, it's pretty expensive, and so you don't have very scalable systems. Up till 2014, no systems had really made it beyond a few tens of robots applied to very simple demonstrations. And then in 2014, Mike Rubenstein from my old lab came out with his work on the swarm. So this is a kilobot swarm. There's 1,024 robots. Again, every robot has the ability to sense, think, and move on its own, and they can communicate locally. And this is really cool hardware, right? Because it suddenly allows us to test all of our swarm intelligence, all of our swarm algorithms out on real hardware with real implementation issues. But again, notice how they're only working on a perfectly smooth whiteboard setting in a highly controlled laboratory environment. And don't be fooled by this picture, these are two. And so there's still a pretty big gap from where we are today to a final system that might actually work in sort of a cluttered environment. If we look at collective construction, it gets a bit more complicated, because here we're looking for robots that can not only manipulate material, typically on the scale of the robot, but also maneuver on top of that material too. And those two challenges, that of climbing and manipulation, they're individually complicated, and putting them together in practice are proving quite hard. There's many examples in 2 dimensions. Here's just a few. Robots docking trusses on an air hockey table. This was done at USC. This here's work by an old colleague, Justin Werfel, where he had these very simple robots placing bricks in predefined patterns. Much less work has translated to 3 dimensions. Again, just a few examples. These are really the pioneers of the field, Terada and Murata, who had these simple arms moving passive bricks around in a structure. And this here's work I did at the University of Southern Denmark in my master's thesis, where I had smart but passive bricks guide active but dumb robots on how to build a structure. And then there's been a recent push for more amorphous construction. Again, work by an old colleague, Niels Knapp at Harvard, where he has this single robot extruding foam to create ramps in unstructured environments. And this year's work at the Institute of Advanced Architecture in Catalonia, where they have these 3 tethered robots slowly extruding structures in a vertical dimension. So again, really cool examples of which way we're going, but there's kind of a lack of proper implementation, right? Still very advanced hardware, it's too expensive, it's prone to error. You never see more than 1 or 2 robots working together at any one time. And the structures they're creating are pretty small compared to the size of the robots. So there are a couple of exceptions. The most notable is the work with quadrotors, both at ETH and UPenn. Let me just point out here that these work with a centralized controller, and they have external sensing, basically a Vicon system that tells them exactly where all the material and all the robots are at all time. So a very different tack to the problem than what I'm going to be presenting for you today. Now, where there's been relatively little work in hardware, there's been quite a lot of work in algorithms, from gradient descent algorithms with how to efficiently guide workload around on a truss structure, work in weightless environments, semi-weightless environments with homogeneous and heterogeneous societies. And these are really great, right? Because they show us that we can achieve a wide range of structures with these multi-agent systems, ranging from systems that have completely centralized control or lots of communication between agents, to systems that have completely decentralized control or no communication between agents. Again, unfortunately, common for all of them is they tend to underestimate how hard it is in real life to actually make hardware that works reliably doing all of these rather complicated tasks. So in summary, we have these 2 bodies of literature that sparsely overlap. There's a pretty big gap between the abstract agents to what's physically realizable, especially in this type of a cluttered construction environment where communication is likely to be unreliable, where any memory you have of the structure you're building is likely to be outdated very fast because a lot of robots are updating the same structure at once. As I said, right now, many use off-board sensing like Vicon systems, and that's hard to imagine working well in a final construction site where robots are actively building structures that shield themselves from range. Finally, we need to focus much more on simple, more robust, more scalable hardware, and that really hasn't been done in the past. Also, I think it's important that we focus not just on making systems that are free of error. It's pretty much impossible to do. I think it's important that we focus on making systems that can tolerate errors that are bound to happen, perceive them, and recover from them before they become a problem to the bigger collective. So what I can show you today, there's still a big gap from where we are to a final system that might work to actually build human-scale structures in a real environment. But what I can show you today is a couple of systems that spans this gap between abstract and real agents, and actually a system that actually manages to produce structures that are large compared to the size of the individual robots. And that's work I did, among other things, in my PhD thesis. And this here's really work I did together with Professor Radhika Nagpal at Harvard and Justin Werfel. And we really did all parts of the system together, But where Justin was more interested in proofs and algorithms, I was more interested in the real physical implementation and the embedded software. So I'm going to be talking about the hardware on these robots, the framework, the algorithms, and the performance of the system. But let me start out by showing you this video I did to go along with our science publication, because it gives a nice overview of the system. So we made this algorithmic framework and a full physical implementation of these systems for collective construction of user-specified three-dimensional structures. Our work was inspired by these African species of termites, millions of which come together to build these amazing mounds out of soil. The termites are able to achieve a high degree of parallelism by passing information through the environment. Now, like the termites, our robots work in a completely decentralized fashion. They have to climb on the structure they're creating. They can only sense their local environments. But through the strong focus on error-tolerant control and co-design, embodied intelligence, we were able to achieve a very reliable system. So it works by taking this blueprint of the structure, some user input, passing it through an offline compiling step to generate a set of traffic patterns, which we then give to an arbitrary number of robots. And the robots then use that set of traffic patterns along with an internal rule set, which is independent of the structure they're creating, to create these user-specified structures with provable guarantees. Now, robots can utilize many different paths through the structure, meaning the structure can emerge in many different ways, but always with this final fixed outcome. And the cool thing about the algorithms is really that robots can utilize, they have no memory of the structure they're building, so I can come in and interfere with the progress of the robot, and it doesn't care. It simply keeps patrolling the structure, doing what it needs doing whenever something, sees something is wrong. And this could be me or another robot, it doesn't matter. So with this work, we hope to have shown how we can achieve rather complicated behaviors with very simple, independent, self-contained robots. And of course, the idea is you build on that in the future to achieve even more complicated things. All right, so I promised to tell you how this works, the framework first. So for that, we have to go back to the termites. As I said, you have millions of them in nests underneath these big mounds. And the mounds are much more than just a pile of dirt. They're an intricate series of channels and chambers that we actually have found work as an artificial lung for the nest site underneath. It's a highly complicated structure. The termites, as I said, work in a decentralized fashion. They're able to achieve this high degree of parallelism by passing information through the environment in this process called stigmergy. They're relatively simple compared to the structure they're creating. They have to climb on it. They certainly don't have the mental capacity to perceive the state of the entire colony. They're localized, meaning they're, in fact, completely blind. So they have to only sense their local environment. And although the system may look messy at times, it is remarkably robust and error tolerant. And through their low-level inputs, they're always able to produce these guaranteed high-level outcomes. So we've taken these ideas and sort of implemented them into a bare minimum robotic system that can still achieve a wide range of structures. So what I'm going to show you today is an algorithm that can build these user-specified three-dimensional structures with many agents, as long as those agents comply with a set of fairly simple constraints. We need robots to be able to perceive locally, meaning the brick at which they're standing and if other robots are nearby. They need to be able to perform limited brick manipulation, meaning they should be able to place a brick directly in front of themselves and never directly in between two other bricks, because that would be hard to achieve. They should be able to add bricks to the structure but not remove them. They should be able to climb up one brick at a time but not up straight walls. And they should be able to avoid other robots but not have to communicate with them. So very, very simple system. Very sort of realistic system to do. So here are the robots I did to go along with that system, robots and bricks. The bricks are made of urethane, which is a light, cheap, sturdy material. They're about the size of a normal brick, and they weigh about a quarter of the robot. The robot is slightly smaller than a brick, so it fits on top of a one-brick wide wall. And when I designed these things, I really had a strong focus on simplicity, robustness, and reliability through two key features. The first is co-design, meaning that for every new challenge, you sort of take a step back and you say, where can we solve that challenge in the simplest possible way? By changing the hardware of the robots, by adding sensors, by changing the shape of the bricks, the structure, changing the embedded hardware or the software or even the governing algorithms, right? Nothing is off limits. And that really allowed me to make a very simple system. In this case, the robot has 3 actuators and 4 types of very simple sensors. And all of the processing is done by simple finite state machines. And then, as I said before, I wasn't focusing here on making a robot that never committed errors. I knew they were going to happen. I focused on making a robot that could continuously evaluate its own process and fix any errors that were bound to happen. So here are the challenges we took on when we designed the system: locomotion, navigation, manipulation, coordination, fabrication, and control, and I'll just briefly touch on each of them. So the first big challenge was that of locomotion, both on level ground and climbing with simple control. So as you can see, we focused our efforts on WEGs. WEGs are a combination of wheels and legs, which is a term coined by Roger Quinn at Case Western. They're really great for fast locomotion over unstructured environments with very simple control. It's kind of what we're trying to achieve too, right? We want robots that can climb very tall bricks, because the taller a robot can climb, the more material you can add every time you add material, and so the faster you can complete a structure of a given size. We want more than just easy control. We also want very accurate control when the robot is walking on top of a structure, so to avoid falling off that structure. And to do that, I added these passive mechanical features in the bricks to help the robots. So I added notches on the side of the brick that are chamfered inward, so as the robot is climbing, it automatically aligns. There are little hooks on the rear WEGs that help the robot gain traction just at the right time. WEGs are great for climbing. They're pretty poor for turning because the radius of the WEG changes over the turn of a rotation. So to improve that, we curved the spokes of the WEGs. I added this indentation bowl. So now, unless the robot is actively trying to climb out, it will stay in that bowl and keep turning. Very simple features. And then just because we had all these indented features in the top, we added inverted features in the bottom and magnets that help them stack and align almost like Legos. So rather complicated challenge solved here in a very simple way by optimizing all parts of the system for each other. Not to go into too much detail on the hardware here, but let me point out that this is a differentially steered robot. So there's a little motor that sits down here that drives the front and rear WEGs through a timing belt. And of course, there's a bunch of considerations behind this robot in how to optimally place the center of mass so that it can climb up and down bricks while carrying and not carrying a brick. All right, next big challenge is that of navigation, both on the structure, where the robot has to keep track of its location with respect to the seat configuration, so placed down here. So to do that, I added visual markers on the bricks, these black and white patterns. 6 IR sensors underneath the robot. Imagine a very coarse black and white 6-pixel camera. And together, these are actually enough to perform accurate pattern recognition as you walk across the structure. I also added a 1-axis accelerometer just so the robots know if they're climbing or not, so they can recognize the structure they're moving over. We need more robots to navigate off the structure, and the goal here is to follow that perimeter back around until they find the seat brick again. I added 4 ultrasound transceivers in the front and the side of the robot so it can do wall following. I added a seed marker, white line on a black floor. And rather than having robots go off into unmarked territory to find new material, which has had trouble in the past in other projects, I just added a brick cache in the beginning of the structure. So now all robots have to do ever is navigate relative to the structure, making them much, much simpler than they would have been otherwise. Again, a complicated challenge solved in a very simple way. So here you see this robot performing wall following, not perfectly, but for this iterative process, it eventually gets the job done. At some point, the robot will pick up on this white line on this floor, and it'll start following that in with the IR sensors. When the accelerometer detects that the robot is climbing, it knows it's on its way up that first seed brick, and it'll start following the path I've given it through the structure. Again, notice how the robot's definitely not perfect. You know, it slips while it's climbing, it misaligns, almost fell off the structure here, but it's continuously reevaluating itself and fixing all these small problems before they become a bigger problem. So it's very reliable in the end. All right. We need manipulation. For that, I added this fixed arm that always protrudes from the robot. There's a little motor that sits down here that can drive this claw up and down. Now, on the tip of the claw, there are 3 prongs. The center prong is fixed and for stability, but the 2 outer prongs are actually forced inwards by torsion springs. So I can force them open by pressing on the back, or I can lower the entire claw, and this wall down here will automatically force them open for me. That means it's really easy to release or grasp a brick, but as soon as I bring the claw back up, they're snapped back into place and hold the brick securely in place. I filleted the handle of the brick to make it really easy for the robot to dock with it, and I added tactile sensing in the front of the claw, push buttons to let the robot know if it has a brick in possession or not. So again, here, a complicated challenge solved in a very simple way by this focus on embodied intelligence. All the robot has to do is lower and raise the claw, and the rest happens automatically in hardware. All right, we need many robots to work on the same structure at once. They don't have to work together in this case, they just have to avoid each other. I send out a low amplitude ultrasound signal for that to happen, so another robot that sees that basically stays put until it's gone. I regulate the strength of that warning signal depending on the situation. So for instance, a robot which is about to place a brick needs a bigger safety perimeter than one that's just circling the structure. Not to go into too much detail on fabrication, but I do want to point it out because it's incredibly important in this kind of an iterative process where you're continuously updating both software and hardware at the same time. So right now I can redo a robot in about a week. That's from starting the 3D printer to ending calibration of all the sensors. Not a pleasant week, but I can do it. Right now it's pretty expensive, but that's because we're 3D printing the entire chassis. This you could optimize in the future if you wanted to. Bricks are actually done in this very nice one-step casting process that I'm happy to talk more about later on, but you can do those very, very fast. And I guess I'm bringing up this slide because I want to say during my thesis I had to do 80 bricks and 9 different robots, and so it was very important to have this strong focus on very easy fabrication. All right. Final piece of the puzzle is the embedded software that goes on those robots. And of course, the goal here is to enable the robots to autonomously build structures with high reliability, but it's also to create a software architecture where you can easily swap in and out different subroutines as the hardware is updated. So I created this hierarchical software architecture that has an algorithmic layer that runs sequentially, a behavioral layer that runs on inputs from either other layer, and a hardware interface layer that runs on interrupts from sensors or timers. So the algorithmic layer obviously holds the algorithms and some higher level shell routines. The behavioral layer holds the more intricate shell routines like align on top of a brick or turn on top of a brick. And then all of these make use of these hardware interface routines that directly set the speed of the actuators or read in from sensors and so on. So of course, it's important to remember that behind each of these settings, there's a longer set of code that ensures that each of these tasks is executed reliably before the next commence. But this really was a nice, clean software architecture. I could easily switch out different routines. I could even translate them between the different levels. And in the end, I actually ended up doing the algorithm on a separate computer that was written in Python, just for ease of debugging. I had the 2 lower level behaviors on an Atmega 1281 that was written in C. Those 2 communicate via Bluetooth. And then I have a separate processor taking care of all the ultrasound related circuitry just because it was rather time consuming. All right. So here you see all parts of that system working together. In this case, I asked the robot to build me this little 10-brick staircase, which is more than 18 times the volume of the robot. That means carrying out 106 instructions correctly in a row. So an instruction can be something like move from one brick to the next, or turn on top of a brick, or pick up a brick, or place a brick. So again, very sort of clear that we have to have a very strong focus on error-tolerant control and very robust, reliable hardware. All right. So I promised to tell you about the algorithms. Again, a high-level overview. We take the user input, which is a blueprint of the structure. We pass it through this offline compiler step to generate a set of traffic patterns. We call the output of that struct path compiler a struct path. It's basically a 2D projection of the structure that you want to create with a number at each side specifying the height of the stack of bricks at that site. And then an edge at each, an arrow at each edge specifying which way robots can travel through the structure. Then we give that struct path to an arbitrary number of robots along with an internal rule set, and we allow them to perform decentralized construction. So, okay, if we take a step back, right, there's 2 key features to this algorithm. The first is this compiler, struct path compiler, which you can give any new structure, and it will automatically tell you whether or not that structure is doable. And if it's doable, it'll give you some traffic pattern that guides the flow of robots over the structure. And then there's this internal rule set, which is independent of the structure and just tied to the mechanical abilities of the robots. Okay, together these 2 guide the robots over the structure and organize their building activity so that the local information available to the robots is enough to guarantee completion of the correct structure. Without those, you might end up in bad situations where something created a cliff that other robots couldn't climb over, or you created a gap in the structure that you'll have to fill in later, which will be hard. And we don't allow either of those to happen. So if we take the struct path compiler first, we can do both linear structures or branching structures or solid structures. 2D projection looks like this, and the output from the struct path compiler would, for example, look something like this. Robots would enter here and then follow these arrows through the structure. So that means that structures emerge in these sort of growing levels of staircases, and I'm happy to talk more about those later on if you'd like. But as I said, we also need this agent rule set to ensure everything is done correctly. So a simple example first. This is an example for a linear path structure. The robots will get a brick, go to and follow the struct path. If the struct path specified a brick at the site they just visited, remember robots can only see the brick they're standing on, so they have to pass over the site they're inspecting before deciding to turn around and place a brick. and it's safe to attach that brick, then they add the brick. If at any point they see another robot, they maintain their distance. Okay, so when is it safe to add a brick? In either of these cases up here, you physically can't add a brick because you're standing at a different layer from where you'd be adding it. In this occasion here, you could add a brick, but you'd be creating a cliff that future robots wouldn't be able to move over, so that's not allowed. If the struct path specified a brick at either of these two sites and you see it missing, then you can turn around and add the brick because you're not hindering the movement of future robots. And this is really cool, right? Because this means that all robots have to keep track of is the configuration of the last two bricks in the structure and where they are in the struct path, so their location with respect to the seed. Very, very simple, very little memory. If we look at multipath structures, the safety check gets a bit more involved, but it's the same idea. You're looking at your local surroundings and ensuring that you're not breaking those rules. Okay, so here there are 3 robots all using the algorithm to complete this castle-like structure. Again, with this idea that we're showing that we only really managed to bridge this gap between abstract and real agents through the strong focus on co-design, embodied intelligence, and error-tolerant control. So we can do a wide range of structures with this system, linear, branching, solid structures. Of course, there are some limitations. We can't do overhangs. We can't do narrow corridors. There has to be an entry and at least one exit point on the exterior boundary of the structure, and there has to be a traversable path for the structure. But I can show you, some pretty cool simulations where we have a lot of robots building a lot of different structures, in this case, a very tall tower. Again, with this idea that we're specifying the high-level output through these low-level, and we can achieve that through these low-level rules. So this is a system that doesn't need an overhead controller to work. We don't need robots to maintain global awareness or even be synchronized. Every robot is easy to add and remove from the system. Completely decentralized control in this case, and highly simple agents that are actually physically realizable. Okay, so if you paid attention, you will notice here that I was still telling you about perfect agents, and in the beginning of my talk, I just told you that's not possible. Yes, that's true. We allowed ourselves to do this in this first version of the system because I managed to produce such a reliable set of hardware. But in the future, you would definitely want to focus on more error tolerance on the algorithmic level as well. Okay, so quick summary. I showed you the algorithmic framework with the compiler and the agent rule set. I showed you at most 3 robots and 50 bricks working at any one time. We had 1 robot autonomously build a structure 18 times the volume of the robots. We've had 3 robots autonomously build structures 14 times the volume of 1 robot. And we've done several performance tests where we've shown that the number of failures that the robots can't correct compared to the number of successful carried out instructions are very small. So we're very happy with the system, but we're still not creating human scale structures. And so continuously during my PhD, I kept banging my head against the wall and saying, okay, well, how can we improve the system? So I kept looking back to the termites and trying to get more inspiration, what key features are we missing? And what I found was actually models of termite construction are not actually based on termites at all. They're based on ants and bees and wasps because they're much easier to work with. So in 2011, 12, and 14, I went along with entomologists to Namibia to try to study the real termites and learn more about this system. These are the termites we work with, Macrotermes mycosini and natalensis. They were discovered in 1809 by Haviland and Schustad. Not much have been done with them since. They prefer their underground dwellings. They're very susceptible to disturbances, and so they're very hard to work with. In situ, one of the cool examples that have been done is this work here by my collaborator, Professor Scott Turner at SUNY University. So here he took the cap off a mound, he put in plaster slowly over 3 months, waited for the plaster to dry, washed away the soil, and got this beautiful one-shot image of what the tunnel network looks like, but he has no idea how that tunnel network emerged or how it changes over the course of the seasons. So, a destructive process and very labor-intensive. What's more commonly done is you take termites out of the mound, you place them into experimental petri dishes with soil, and you see what happens. This is problematic on its own because termite behavior tends to deteriorate with the time they spend away from the colony, lasting a couple of hours or at most a day. But you can get them to construct some things. Of the experiments that have been directly interested in construction, only the gross outcome have been recorded, meaning you left termites in there for a couple of hours, they built something, you come back and you see what they did, but you have no idea what the individual termite did or why it decided to do so. And also, although there's been recent great advances in trackers for both ants and bees and wasps, they hadn't really made it to termites because they're so much harder to work with. So all the observations done are manual, which naturally leads to a very sparse data set. Okay, I'm not an entomologist, disclaimer, but I figured with my background I could help by coming in and developing a toolkit that will allow more quantitative, high-resolution data sets than had been possible in the past. So we did many things. Just to highlight a few projects, this here was work we did in situ. Basically, we're cutting a slit in the mound. We place in an ant farm 2 parallel glass plates, and then we observe what happens as the termites bring up soil from the nest to try to plug that hole. And we can compare this alarm response between different colonies and also between different species, so it gets quite interesting. We've looked at a way to build a 3D scanner directly in the field. We can observe how termites move soil around in these experimental arenas continuously over time. And I'm happy to talk more about these projects later on, but really our main contribution was work I did together with undergraduate Eric Slentz at Harvard, which are these semi-automated MATLAB trackers for tracking unmarked termites in these recordings of experimental arenas. So a couple of things here again. The termites are unmarked. That's important because that means we save a lot of time having to mark them. And as I said, they don't like being away from their mound. And also, where normal trackers are interested in rather short-lived behavior like interactions, we're interested in very slow behavior construction. So we need our trackers to stay reliable over tens of minutes, which is hard to do. So we ask the user to monitor the system, and we prompt them in case of uncertainty. And we've actually managed to get a very, very reliable output from this. So from these systems, we can track about 100 termites in a 15-minute video in 2 days, which is a process that before would take us several weeks. We can use the data from these positions and orientations. We can ask the user to specify when termites pick up and place soil, because that's hard to automatically see in these low-resolution videos. And then we can automatically label the behavior of the termites, whether they're wandering, resting, this one's transporting soil, or excavating. So this is really cool, right? Because it allows us a whole new insight to what the termites do over their time in the arena and how their behavior tends to change. So I wish I could say we'd done more work with these trackers, but it's really very new work. And we've only done a couple of exploratory experiments. This is work I've done together with Paul Bardunias at Florida Atlantic University. We've come across a couple of interesting research thrusts, but probably the most interesting is that we found indications of task allocation in termites. And this is something that's never been seen before. It's really cool because it's typically a big topic of discussion in swarm robotics, like how much efficiency can we gain by doing task allocation. So this here is the same Petri dish, but 4 different termite paths in each of those Petri dishes. Most termites, they do this. They explore the arena. At some point, they decide to dig. And then they start carrying soil just to the edge of excavation so they can get back in there and excavate more. But a few termites specifically pick up soil and carry it further. So these results are not really robust on their own, but they certainly do merit future, more rigorous studies. And I'm very excited to continue this work in the future. All right. That's the work I did during my PhD. So let me move on to the work I'm doing at the Max Planck Institute for Intelligent Systems in Germany. And this may seem like a bit of a jump in context, but bear with me for a second. What I did when I came to MPI was I sort of, again, took a step back and said, well, how can we design these robot collectives in ways that are much simpler, much more robust, much more scalable than we have been able to in the past? And I actually arrived at soft robot collectives for construction. OK, so soft robots typically are said to have the benefits of being able to traverse unstructured terrains. They can survive high-impact falls. They can squeeze through narrow gaps. They're resilient to a wide range of chemicals, including moisture. They have the ability to be made very simple and very inexpensive. And of course, they're compliant and safe around humans. And there are examples in nature where you have soft cells merging to form solid structures out of their own bodies. Up here is an example of dictyostelium. So this is slime mold, where you have these ground-living amoebas that, when starved, will aggregate to form a slug. And eventually, that slug will turn into a fruiting body made up of a stalk of dead cells and spores in the top. Let's see, I think it's coming up here. Yeah. So similarly, you may imagine having very simple soft robots performing chemotaxis and eventually forming solid structures out of their own bodies. And you may even imagine having them do rigidity changes to also make rigid structures, sort of like this conceptual image you see up here on the top. So, before I was working with robots that were rigid and able to manipulate material, and now I'm talking about robots that can actually build out of their own bodies. I'm not saying this will be an easy goal, it's a long-ranging goal, but I think the outcome might be accordingly great. And I don't have time to cover all of the related work, but suffice it to say that although there's been recent great advances in both locomotion and manipulation, there's still a lot of challenges to be overcome in soft robots, from actuation, sensing material, and control. So right now, most soft robots use air or fluid-filled flexible chambers through the use of compressors or pumps. through either tethers like this robot or bulky payloads like this robot up here. This is a meter long. And so, they're still tethered. They're not that exciting. But the work I'm doing in my postdoc, I'm focusing on actuation and trying to come up with a way in which we can actually enable these soft, small-scale, untethered robots as well. This is work I'm doing together with Dr. Lindsay Hines at MPI. And if you look at this system, these are 3 soft membranes, all tied together by an internal air channel. If I apply a very high voltage across one of the membranes, then I can create a very large controlled deformation without breaking the seal of the chamber, and so without these bulky compressors or pumps. So this here is a compact, low-complexity soft actuator with large, stable, and repeatable shape changes. OK. Works by combining 2 concepts. The first is dielectric elastomer actuators. If you place compliant electrodes on either side of an elastomer, apply a very high voltage between them, 5,000 volts, the Coulomb force between them will effectively squeeze the material and stretch it out. The second concept is hyperelastic materials with snap-through instabilities. So the simplest example I could think of here was a latex balloon. If you look at this balloon animal, you look at the tail. The pressure inside the tail everywhere is the same, but the tip of the tail is at a very high strain. The rest of the tail is at a very low strain, right? So for one pressure, you achieve 2 drastically different volumes. And these are stable, right? Unless I externally agitate the tip of the tail, it's going to stay inflated. So researchers have used this in the past to sort of have an elastomer here and then use the DEAs to push the elastomer past this cusp in the membrane to create very large deformations and sealed chambers. But none so far have shown the ability to reverse that deformation without breaking the seal of the chamber, and so they're not very useful. And that's exactly what we're doing up here. We're fluidically coupling multiple chambers together in order to create these very large repeatable deformations. So we've looked at this both in practice and analytically. And this here is a simulated example of a 2-membrane actuator. This material here, this pressure volume curve, comes from an acrylic elastomer, VHB 4910, which is pretty popular for DEA applications. The pressure inside the chamber is picked so that one membrane is past the snap-through instability, the other is just on the verge. And now if I activate one membrane, then I'm artificially expanding the internal volume of the chamber, so the pressure will drop. And also, I'm going to obtain a new pressure volume curve because I'm effectively thinning out the material. Now, depending on the viscous elastic properties of this material, membrane one will slowly deflate past this new cusp in the membrane into the new pressure at a much higher volume, whereas membrane 2 will deflate to a much lower volume. And now, if I turn off my actuator again, the system is going to revert to its initial pressure, but now at a new stable state where membrane 1 is bigger than membrane 2. So we can predict these stable states, and this is a method we've modified from Lee et al. But basically, we could look at the number of molecules in membrane 1, because it's a sealed system. We can use the ideal pressure law to come up with a pressure versus the number of molecules in that membrane. We can look at the number of molecules in the rest of the system, again with respect to the number of molecules in membrane 1, so the number of total molecules minus the number of molecules in the rest of the system. And this curve is slightly skewed, right, because we're adding the air in the fixed chamber as well. Now, we know the system is at the same pressure everywhere. So only the points where these 2 curves overlap is where the system is at an equilibrium. By examining the area around those points, we can tell whether they're stable or unstable. So the stable point here is where the 2 membranes are at the same size, and either of these are where one membrane is bigger than the other. We can do this also for when we activate the membrane, and our model accurately predicts that we have only one stable state in this case. So we can do this for any number of stable states, right? We can add as many membranes to the system as we want. So we've looked at many different materials for this type of actuator, and what we're looking for is really a very low viscosity material, so something that has fast stretch recovery time, so you have a very fast actuator. We're looking for a highly nonlinear material, so it's very stable states, potentially with high volume differences. We're looking for a very soft material with a high dielectric constant, so you don't need a lot of voltage to perturb the material. And of course, the higher the breakthrough voltage, the more voltage you can apply without hurting the material. Now, we haven't found a single piece of material that together can work through all of these areas. What we're using up here is the acrylic elastomer, which is really great in all of these areas, but it has high viscosity, meaning it's very slow. Right now, state transitioning takes about 10 minutes. If you're willing to trade off your volume deformations, your high volume deformations with say speed, then you could use something like EcoFlex and get a system which was up to 1,000 times faster. This here is the experimental results from this video. So for example, to enter stable state 1, we can activate membrane 1, so with 3,500 volts. The volume will slowly expand. At some point, when the other membranes are below that point of snap-through, we can turn off the system and achieve a stable state here. And if we want to achieve a new stable state, we activate membrane 2, for instance. We wait till the other membranes are below the point of snap-through and turn off the system. So these stable states here, we have more than 400% volume difference, so quite big volume differences. And if we compare those volume differences to each other, we can see that in the stable states, they're very repeatable and consistent. So we're very happy with this actuator. Obviously, there are some bad things about it. One is it does require feedback. We do need to keep one membrane activated until all the other ones have deflated below that point of snap-through. Yes, we're proposing a very simple system to do that. In this case, we're just measuring the capacitance of the deflating membranes. Also, as with many soft systems, it has an inherently low force profile. But you can play around with the internal volume a bit, the internal pressure of the system a bit to increase this number. On the bright side, we do have large repeatable deformations. We have a number of stable states depending on the number of membranes you have in the system. It's compact size. Yes, it's still tied to a high voltage DC to DC converter, but it's very low power. So the DC converter we're using is a cubic centimeter, very small, and we can drive it off batteries. And finally, it's very low complexity. And of course, here I'm showing you a rigid base, but you could imagine replacing that with a soft base in the future as well. So right now, we're actually using this actuator and incorporating it into these soft robots, which hopefully will eventually turn into these soft robot collectives that can build out of their own bodies as well. All right, let me just give you some concluding remarks, sort of allude to my future research vision here. So I showed you these robots in the beginning. These are robots for collective construction of user-specific three-dimensional structures. And I think there's more we can learn from these robots. If we extend the capabilities of the robots to also remove material from the structure, then we can use them as a platform with which to examine more error-tolerant algorithms. We can examine our algorithms that can remove material or failed robots from the structure, algorithms that can add temporary material to fix mistakes, and this is a long-term goal, but also algorithms that may be able to handle external perturbations. This is not going to be easy, but certainly having reliable hardware to implement this on will be a very big advantage. Yeah. Of course, I'm going to continue my work with the macro termites. As I said, we developed this great toolkit with which we can study them. We found indications of task allocation, but I'm also interested in looking at how they efficiently pass information through the environment and what other types of information they pass directly between each other. And of course, the hope is that the knowledge we gain from these systems will feed back into our robotic systems as well. Long term, I'm interested in stop this work for controlled laboratory settings and rather move the systems out of the lab into construction in the real world. I showed you my first research thrust towards that with these novel actuator methodologies that will enable these soft robots that can build out of their own bodies. And beyond that, I'm interested in no longer creating structures according to specific shapes, and rather creating structures according to functionality. If you look to nature, you never see the same structure twice, right? Animals build according to what the environment dictates. And for us, it might mean building a structure of an approximate volume or shape, or maybe it means building a well-ventilated structure. It doesn't really matter. The point is, if you're building according to structure functionality, you have a lot of leeway in how to accomplish that goal. So small-scale errors don't necessarily prevent the progress of the entire collective. I'm also interested, long-term, to start work with construction with materials that you can find on-site. Again, this will be added challenges in both manipulation and navigation, but you no longer have to worry about bringing material to the site of construction or cleaning it up afterwards. You can potentially include things that are already at the site of construction, and you can even create continuous smooth structures. So there's lots of applications for this, from construction in extraterrestrial areas where you physically cannot bring material along, to construction, to more pressing scenarios like construction of levees in flooded areas. This is a topic that, at least in Europe, have gained a lot of recent interest. And then, of course, I'm interested in continuing my work with collectives in nature, developing toolkits, understanding what governs their systems, how do they coordinate in such a massively scalable way, and how do they handle both internal and external perturbations. So that's sort of what I would like to leave you with today. I think I'm still on time. Sort of a wide range of topics, all tied together by this overarching goal of advancing our understanding of how to design and coordinate robot collectives, and correspondingly how social insects do so in nature. And then just a final thank you slide to all the people at Harvard on the termites team, and of course my new group at Max Planck Institute. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that really stimulating talk, Kirstin. And we have time for a few questions from the audience. Questions? Dr. Chiswick.
So you mentioned removing failed robots, which is certainly something that ants and bees do. Are failed robots going to say, I failed, or is your remover robot going to identify failure, and if so, how?
Yeah, the question is how to deal with failed robots. And I think the concept when you're building robot collectives is that a failed robot is so cheap that you wouldn't even bother fixing it. You push it off the structure, you get it away. So, that could be pushing it off the structure. Maybe you don't want to hurt other robots, so maybe you want to actually pick it up and carry it off.
But how do you know it's failed?
I see. Yeah, so it's a very interesting question, right? So depending on what type of failed is. So one fail can be, it's a kidnapping scenario. I navigated wrong, now I'm finding myself in a part of a structure which I don't recognize and it doesn't make sense. So in that case, the robot itself could try to move off the structure. In another case, maybe it's gotten stuck. This has happened quite often. You can use the ultrasound signal again to send out a distress signal, which would basically have, again, robots coming to unplug things. The hardest one is if robots fail completely, because then it looks like a passive object, right? And so this is a very simple system that probably wouldn't have the ability to see that. That's not true. Actually, it does. So sometimes I add a little sensor here on the front, which just detects, it will detect if there's a structure there. You could even do it with the ultrasound. And so a structure which is taller than 1 brick tall shouldn't be there, right? There should always be a staircase. So that would be one way to see that something is wrong.
More?
If you had the time to build more of the small construction robots, so where would you feel like your current systems would start maybe breaking down, or where you just couldn't construct, they would be mostly in their way and things like that?
Yeah, so how would I extend this hardware, and at what point would the current concept start to break down? I think I understood it right, yep. Well, so right now, no overhangs, very, very simple structures, which I would definitely like to change in the future. I think, the current robots are great because they show us that we can achieve a wide range of structures where they're simpler robots, and they've sort of allowed us new key insights into robot collectives. That being said, these are not very interesting structures. The ones I want to focus on in the future are functional structures. And so that's a very different set of hardware. It's the same approach. You still optimize the hardware specifically for the task at hand, but suddenly robots are manipulating material, which was very different from this predefined material. I don't know if that answers your question. Okay.
So there's a lot of interest now in 3D printing and new ways to do manufacturing. If you had a lot of systems like this that were working really well, do you think could you build 3D printers that could do things that can't be done today? Have you thought about what sorts of things those would be?
Yeah. So it's a good question. The question is whether you could have 3D printers, with this kind of technology, working to do things that are beyond what 3D printers can do today. Right. So yes, right now there is actually a guy who is 3D printing big structures down at USC, Koshnevis. Yes, so there's great things that you can achieve with this system, right? It's a much more parallel. A lot of robots can work on the same task at once. It's much more redundant. If something breaks here, we're only going to lose one robot, not the entire system. But also, with 3D printers, as soon as you build an overhang, you're obstructed from getting to that point. Here you have robots that are crawling, and so they can get to any of the internal spaces and continuously update them. So yeah, I think some collaboration there would be fantastic.
I wondered if you've analyzed the computational properties of the compiler, in particular things like completeness. If there exists some plan, will the compiler, a construction plan, will the compiler find it? And also about the efficiency. So how much longer do the plans generated by the compiler take than, say, an optimal plan might?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the question is, how optimal is this compiler, and can we guarantee completion and proofs and so on? So right now, our struct path compiler, the one that generates a set of traffic patterns, is not optimized at all. It's a brute force. It'll simply keep going until it finds some version and gives it to the robots. There's lots of ways, and we can guarantee that it will find it if it's there, right? Because it's brute force. That being said, there's lots of optimizations you could do on a compiler like that. For example, right now, every robot task is not the same amount of energy. So I could optimize the number of paths through the structure compared to how much building process that would be needed. So for instance, if a structure is a branching structure and there's not that much construction this way, but it's really long, then it makes sense to get more robots working on this task rather than going over here. And if you had a more centralized controller that continuously was monitoring the state of the system, then you would obviously be able to do a more efficient construction. For a linear path structure, that's not true, right? It's a pipeline of robots. They all have to move through the structure, so there's no point of them knowing the entire progress of the system. They're going to get to a point that's interesting when they get there. But yeah, I think it's a sliding scale. I think there's, it's not right to only have robots working in this fashion. I think it makes sense to study this and see how far we can get with it, and then eventually add, more centralized controllers along the way.
Yes.
At what level of granularity is the termite, the algorithm that the termites are using understood? Like, do we know, like roughly what they're doing or not?
Yeah. So the question is, how well do we understand the termites and what they do? We don't. Very, very few people are working in this research area. We have some idea of what stimulus they have, and we have some ideas of how we can trick them. And if we can trick them, then we have some idea of what kind of internal rules that they do have. We understand much more about ants and bees and their construction than we do about termites.
Up there.
Why do the structures have to be like additive and permanent? Because it seems like each robot starts by taking something off the starting point. So why could you not build ramps and then take them down?
Yeah, sure. So 2 answers to that. Ramps are...
Don't forget.
Sorry, yes. Right, so the question is, why do the structures only have to be additive in this case? They don't. So we have looked into, first the software side, can we do a compiler that's still completely distributed that can build a ramp, build a really tall structure, and then remove that ramp again? We can. It gets a little more tricky, right? Because there sort of has to be an agreement between the robots of when the structure is done and when you can start taking that ramp apart again. So you need a little more memory, but it's doable. In the case of the hardware, these robots they're too lightweight. So if they tried to pick up a brick once it had attached with the magnets, it would fall over. But physically, they have the strength to do it.
How soon do you think construction workers need to start worrying?
So the question is, how soon do construction workers have to worry? I'm not going to target, you're building your house for you, even though I know some of you are in lack of property here. Right now, human construction workers are pretty efficient. They do really great, and also you can get workers very cheap. So it's a hard industry to compete with. I do work a lot with architects, and they're very excited about the idea of robots in construction because it means that we can build in a whole new fashion, right? We don't have to worry about material that was optimized for human hands. We can build all kinds of new things that were just optimized specifically for those robots. So I'm targeting more applications where it's hard for humans to work, really cold areas, disaster areas, underwater areas, extraterrestrial areas, places where it doesn't matter that it takes a long time. It's just nice that you can send a really cheap, simple system along, and eventually they'll get the job done.
So you're saying that termites create more construction jobs than they eliminate right now.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay.
Yeah, I like it.
I have one question. Have you looked at using this kind of thing for demolition?
Yeah, and I know my old colleague Neil Snapp is interested in that area as well. He lives in Buffalo, so. But yeah, there's a ton of things you can do in this research area, right? From from demolition to burrowing, like you could create a structure by removing material from a big area. You could think of reconfigurable structures, so something where you're continuously modifying the structure for whatever the internal environment dictates. And yeah, all kinds of things, and I'm excited about all of them. But at the end of the day, I'm using this as a platform with which to study robot collectives, trying to extract what do we need to know to try to design these very scalable and robust systems.
Great. Yes?
What about tunneling? We have a little problem in Seattle.
Yeah, actually, it's kind of interesting that you mentioned it, right? Because tunneling is also, it's sort of a good area where you don't need robots that are super high, that have super high sensitivity, right? Because they're in a pretty confined space. And so, localized sensors are fine. Termites never leave their mound. If they need to go somewhere, they build a tunnel to get there, And I don't see the problem with that. I think it's a great concept.
When you're thinking about error tolerance, can you model sort of the things that might go wrong in terms of just individual robots in the collective failing, or sort of large bad external events like some researchers inserting a thing into the termite mound? Are there sort of other types of errors or things that can go wrong and you would want to worry about, like a malicious actor in the system?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the question is, how much can we model about error tolerance and how many things can go bad? We haven't done much on it right now. You certainly could. I would find it, more interesting than just modeling it. I would find it more interested to, like you say, actually try it out on a termite mound. Right now, when we set our trap and we effectively demolition a large part of the mound, within a day that will be plugged. And so they're very, very fast. And it would be great to see not just how do they do it, but this alarm response again, like how do they recruit other workers, because it's hard for the termites to realize that something is wrong all the way up there.
All right, let's thank the speaker. Oh, why don't you come down informally after we thank the speaker?